Hello, everybody. So, we are here. All the panelists are ready. I would like to ask everybody to sit down and to listen to the, of course, most important panel, because it's on SDG 16. Oh. The most important SDG. Gert agrees. So, why is this panel important? This panel is very important for the journey we made during IID 2018. We went through the zones of experimentation. We had a wonderful panel just before on policy making, experimentation-based and evidence-based. And now we're asking ourselves, what does this all mean for the future of governance and peace building? We have experts, governance and peace building experts with us from different areas, working different areas of governance and peace building. And we have our dear moderator, Sarah Lister, who is the director of the UNDP Oslo Governance Center. And I will directly hand over to her to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Isabel. And this is a very important panel. And there's another reason why it's an important panel, which is a rather scary piece of research from behavioral economics that says that it's people's last experience of something that colors their memory of it. So if you have a terrible holiday and it rains all the time and the kids are sick and the dog is sick, if you have a good last day, you will think it was a fantastic holiday. And I'm wondering if the same principle will apply to conferences, that we have obviously had a fantastic conference, and we now need to end with a fantastic and enlightening final panel to make sure that everybody heads out thinking very carefully about what we've talked about. We're obviously not going to wrap up in this panel. We're obviously not going to answer all the questions. What I hope to do is that in the next hour and a half or so, we will provide some ways to think about what we've been talking about, provide some further reflections from our panel here, from different backgrounds. And we are returning now to the 5 themes that were in the presented yesterday morning on the areas of governance, and we are loosely going to talk about those: the future of human rights and the rule of law, the future of politics and inclusive decision making, the future of governance for inclusive and sustainable growth, the future of responsive institutions and service delivery, and the future of conflict and peace. But we obviously, in an hour and a half, can't manage to talk about all of those issues, but I hope that there will be some more provocative thoughts and ideas to take away and to think about further. I think it's been a challenging few days. It's been a challenging few days for me. And one of the reasons I think it has been challenging is because we've been having a number of different discussions, groups of discussions. We've been talking about different things. And I know everybody orders their thoughts in different ways, but when I was trying to get my thoughts together about all the issues that we've been talking about, I realized, I think, that we've been having 3 sets of conversations, or I've been participating in 3 sets of conversations. The first has been around the very interesting and some really fascinating experiments and innovation. What can we learn from those? What are the opportunities? What are some of the risks? Are they scalable? Those are, the bedrock of the discussions we've been having. But I think we've also been having a second set of discussions around how does progressive change happen in societies? And what are the incentives for change? What is the relevance of experimentation and evidence to policy change? What are the incentives for individuals and societies to change? And how is the digital transformation that we are seeing affecting those incentives and changing the way that societies are functioning? I think we've just had an excellent, really excellent panel, which I thoroughly enjoyed, on evidence, experimentation as part of evidence, participation as part of that evidence mix. But I also wonder, you know, in the societies that many of us work in or have worked in, to what extent is policy based on evidence, whether it's experimental or other, at all? I think Angela made the really excellent point that I would have liked more discussion on, the demand for evidence to support policy, and how do we create that? And then the third set of conversations I think we've been having are about the even more profound shifts that are in place and what effect they are having on what people like me would talk about as the social contract. You know, the relationship between governors and governed, whatever that looks like, how we order our societies, within our societies and between societies, state-based or non-state-based. And we are all used to sets of arrangements where control is balanced against freedom, rights, and responsibilities. And those governance systems are constantly shifting. But have we reached a stage in the world where the shifts are so profound that those existing social contracts are being shifted for good or for ill? And what are the implications of those shifts for how we work, not just as UNDP, we'll be talking about that tomorrow, but for all of us in our different environments. So I think alongside the innovation, you know, the experimental discussion, the evidence-based policy-making discussion, we've also been having a more existential discussion that has come through at the different levels on, you know, what is the shape of this future world and how is governance going to be arranged in that? So I don't want to take much more time. Our panelists have been asked to provide some reflections from where they sit on what they've heard for the last few days around the different themes within governance. If they want to also talk about perhaps those three different sets, they are able to. I won't introduce them at length. I will just briefly introduce them as I pass the floor to them. And the first person to speak, who's going to provide some sort of more theoretical, conceptual input, but some practical ideas as well, will be Leif Kalev, who is Professor of State and Citizenship Theory at Tallinn University. Thank you.
Hello. We have had 2 rich days, and it's really challenging to summarize and reflect these in 5 minutes. So my answer to this task is to draw 3 large axes that somehow summarize the topics discussed for me. And afterwards, I draw some elaborations, mostly based on my competence in politics and governance studies, especially state-citizen interface. And then maybe I have one suggestion or idea forward. So the 3 axes. The first one, obviously, is the question or axis of technology and human agency or human role. Much has been discussed here. One issue that somehow puzzled me was that most of the solutions and proposals included some attempt to order, regularize, systematize, and so on. In the literature on human and computer possibilities, this is actually the realm of the computers. Humans are bestowed with creativity, novelty, thinking outside of the box. So maybe this is an aspect that we should reflect further in this dimension. The second axis is evolution versus disruption. Is it creative destruction? Is it revolution? Something else? As we already heard, organizations tend to favor evolution. The environment might change quite radically. So here we find another tension. Organizations somehow have to make an extra effort to actually utilize human creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. This is maybe another line to think forward. But my main comments are along the third axis, that is top-down versus bottom-up power, decision-making, legitimating, participation, and all these aspects. Much has been discussed also here, but what could be thought more in the future is the role of the state and especially governance apparatus, state apparatus. One clear issue is of legitimacy. We have been talking about ways citizens can participate more. And this is mostly bottom-up. It could be facilitated top-down. But also, state authorities need to possess power in a sustainable manner. And for this, they need legitimacy. In late modernism, legitimacy is being transformed. We have been spoken of abstract legitimation, meaning we legitimize by general rationales. Appealing to these, you have no other viable alternative. And we have the legitimation that is called performative legitimacy or legitimation. This means you interact, you try to get people in somehow. Both of these legitimation types are somewhat non-representative. They are related to interactive governance, and so they possess both possibilities and risks. Possibilities in case of well-elaborate application, risks as an easy way towards more authoritarian governance systems. This is an item to think forward. And the other aspect of bottom-up, top-down is related to discussing facts, politics, and so on. Here, maybe the framework of knowledge democracy would be useful. It has three main players: state authorities, knowledge producers, and the media that establish public sphere. Now, we mostly discussed public authorities. To an extent, knowledge producers. But knowledge is actually much more richer. And we didn't discuss so much the public sphere or channels of communication and information at large. This is also something to think forward. To come to my suggestion, I build up on the discussion of big data. I was in the workshop where it was well demonstrated that big data can be utilized in two ways. One is surfing, spotting, finding some general flows that are meaningful for our policy interests. The other, work as a detective, find evidence, fight for human rights in specific situations, establishing facts, and so on. So you can go very large, you can go very deep. Evolutionary innovation, as in organizations, can be scaled up to an extent. And I think both aspects have something in common, both very focused and very broad. They need some kind of clear-cut digital baseline. So if we really want some ambition, as discussed in yesterday's reflection, one possibility is to move forward with a common digital identity around the globe. It would serve as some kind of basic proof of status, basic data. You can attach whatever to it. Of course, it would foster the role of UN in global governance. It needs cooperation of the states, filling the gaps. It's an ambitious and big scale, but still, I think, possible use of this new situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. There was a lot in there and a really interesting idea at the end that we might want to pick up on. I'm sure Hossein will be picking up on the public sphere and the communication aspect when he makes his intervention. But you also interestingly raised this issue of legitimacy, which actually I haven't been in many discussions on that in the last few days. And I think that there's also some I think we need to question assumptions around what makes states and others legitimate to whom and for what. There's some very interesting research that's come out of ODI and a consortium of partners in recent years in fragile environments about whether service delivery in fragile environments supports state legitimacy in those contexts or not. And it has some quite surprising findings, which non-intuitive ones. So I think that's a nice link actually in to start talking about some of the conflict issues. We'll go to our two panelists who are going to talk about conflict-related issues. Jonathan, I've temporarily lost your job description, but I know you're at Executive Director, sorry, Conciliation Resources. We've been talking for the last few days. I've forgotten your job title.
I do regularly as well. Thanks ever so much, and thanks for everyone for your contributions these days. It's been fascinating. When I was invited, I looked at the list of speakers and I thought, well, I don't know any of these speakers, so it must be interesting. And it certainly has proven to be so. I want to just reflect on three areas. One is to put peace building on the map a bit more, because I'm not going to speak about conflict as such, because I think conflict is such a complex and deep challenge. What we're interested in are the solutions and what we do about it. And so peace building is something I want to talk about, and the pressing issues for peace building, and put those in context. And I want to then try and align those with what's come out of the innovation days for me, and then to align that with what new technology and some of the new thinking can do to help address some of these threats. And I start off by emphasizing peace building, because I think peace building is becoming more and more mainstream. I think there are still some anomalies. I know that in UN parlance, it's all too regular to talk about post-conflict peace building, which to me is rather strange, because most of the situations that are described as post-conflict continue to be conflict-ridden. And to me, peace building is something that you don't only do after the conflict, it's actually an essential component of getting to a resolution and indeed a transformation of the conflict. And I'm very pleased to see how peace building is becoming more and more mainstream as an idea. And indeed, as a result of a campaign that a dozen or so peace-building organizations conducted this autumn, we've now got the word peace-building into a lot of the major dictionaries. So hopefully, once they update their electronic versions, you'll no longer see a squiggly red line under the word peace-building, which for some of us will be quite a relief. But I think there are some real threats to peace-building at the present time that we should be thoughtful about. And they range from the need to actually protect the space for peace building in the face of an increasing preoccupation with national security and securitized responses to violent conflict. And within that, we see an ever greater emphasis on issues around stabilization, on agendas such as countering violent extremism, and on discussions around fragile states. And I think whilst these all have their place, there's a real dilemma in limiting the discussion to these issues, because I think it removes some of the creative endeavor that peace building actually allows, and some of the responses that are on the soft edges. And we've heard some interesting observations around soft power in these past 2 days. And I think that the tension between hard and soft power, I'm worried about the tendency for hard power to be more and more prevalent. And so that's where I think the urgency for a greater focus on peace building lies. But I'm also very conscious that the space for engaging this is being reduced by the nature of much authoritarian governance that we see in the world today, and the space for civic engagement is under threat in many places. I'm also very conscious, as a representative of a non-governmental organization, that in the work we do, we're increasingly challenged to engage in a more transactional relationship around the funds that support us, rather than focusing on the transformative work that we do. And I think it's crucial that we get that balance between transactional and transformative right. And I'm also very conscious that, notwithstanding the fact that there have been extraordinary developments, progress in terms of the normative standards that inform our work, and the whole Women, Peace and Security body of UN resolutions is testimony to this, as is the more recent development around the Youth, Peace and Security Resolution 2250. I think that from a normative perspective, a lot of what we do in the name of peace building is also being challenged in the modern world. So these are some real threats to us. And so it's exciting to come and talk about innovation, to hear people talk about innovation in a very creative way. And at the same time, I have some reservations, because I think, I'd like to think that all of us in this room have been trying to do innovative things for many years, some of us for decades. And yeah, innovation is suddenly imbued with a new sexiness. And we're all talking about innovation as if it's sort of a new fruit on the tree, whereas it isn't. So I think we've got to put it in perspective. To me, it's not so much about focusing on the word innovation. It's about focusing on how we can ensure that the responses we devise are bold and fresh, and that the relationship of these bold and fresh responses to new technology is one whereby opportunities are harnessed, but the ideas are not hostage to new technology or to the ever-encroaching and ever-expanding digital world. And so I think there's an urgency not to lose sight of a willingness to take risks. And of course, taking risks means that you'll oftentimes get things wrong. And that's a very uncomfortable thing in regards to, first of all, one's accountability to the funds that are supporting one to do what one does. And secondly, and even more importantly, when you're engaging in issues in relation to war and peace, if you get things wrong, it can have very significant impact on the lives of the people you're working with. And so there's a reluctance to experiment and get things wrong, and yet there's an imperative to experiment and get things wrong. So I think there's an interesting tension that we need to explore in that. And I'd also say that we mustn't let our aspiration for the new, for innovation, to stand in the way of actually getting the basics right. Because an awful lot of what we all do all the time around good analysis, around really listening to the people we're working with, around participation and inclusion, around facilitating dialogue in meaningful ways and creating meaningful space for people who come from conflicting sides to engage with one another. These are things that are, on the one hand, the everyday, and on the other hand, the exceptional. And we've got to make sure we get these right regardless of bringing in new and creative approaches to make them even more effective. So where does this leave us in terms of what do the new technologies and the new digital opportunities do for us? And I think we've heard some fantastic stories around how we can do analysis in ever deeper and more creative ways, how we can use big data, how we can think through ways to influence policy, which I think is so critical to this whole conversation. And within this, I think there are a couple of key points for me that I want to emphasize. One is around what I would call localization. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable using the word because I always find the word local has a hint of being patronizing about it, because at the end of the day, we're all local to our own context, and yet we call other people local when we talk about their context. But I think what's really important is that we don't lose sight of the agency and the voice and the ownership of the people who are affected by by the violence and the fragility in the context where we work, and seeing how can new technologies bring even more authority to the engagement and the voices of the people we work with. I think that provides an impetus for us to think more about what we mean by partnership, what we mean by networks, and not to lose sight of a rather old-fashioned term, which is around movements. And we've, to an extent, begun to projectize social change rather than recognize that most social change comes from movements that arise within the societies themselves when the demand for change is sufficiently loud. And this leads me on to another important point, which is around power. We had a great session on power today, and I think we've not discussed in the forum at all issues around the inequalities between north-south dynamics around power, and I think that is still something that is extraordinarily prevalent in our world, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So a very final observation, and Indy made a great point about ennobling people to do the right thing and to bring about change that is meaningful. And Pia also, I think, brought in the issue of the relationship between technology and values. And I'd just like to end by saying I think that at the heart of what we all do is the ability to nurture meaningful relationships. And to do that, we need to recognize that conflicts and peace building are about people and they're about politics. And that we need to hold on to not just the technical opportunities that innovation brings us, but the ethical compass that helps us navigate that, and the moral vision that I think at times is under siege in our world at the moment, but which has to guide creative and effective work.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that really clear, absolutely, elucidation of some of the issues that we've been wrestling with and some of the challenges. I was struck by, on your final remarks, actually, with the similarity from Pia in the previous session, who I wasn't expecting to say, but she was saying this is a values discussion. And I really wasn't expecting that from somebody who held that position. And it's great to hear you also making that point. I was also pleased that you highlighted this, the dangers of experimentation discussion, because this morning when we were talking about it, the sort of, there seemed to be an assumption, well, it's fun to experiment, and at some point the regulation will catch up. I'm paraphrasing slightly, I'm sure it's not like that. But actually in some circumstances, it's imperative that the regulatory framework catches up really, really fast, because there is harm, real harm being done to people. And in fact, I think that was the point that our excellent keynote speaker made this morning, about you need to experiment when the stakes are low, so that you get these things in place. Staying on the peace-building theme, I'm going to pass the word to Shakirat, who is the country director for International Alert in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for these 2 days of very interesting discussions. And yeah, I guess I will be talking more as a practitioner, who's someone working on the ground, rather than sort of like looking at more strategically, but looking at from the sort of bottom up, from the ground approach. Grassroots sort of kind of work. I think at the first day we heard this, that technology is just a tool, and what matters is how you use it. And this is something, I guess, to me was actually the theme of the 2-day discussions, because I think it's technology. It's actually on one side it creates challenges, but also how you use it. I mean, we know it's with the shifting geopolitical dynamics, with the contemporary challenges, the technology could be used for the good and for the bad. And I think we had a good discussion about how it should be used, and how, you know, like basically you're applying technology. And then also about innovation. We talked a lot about and considered innovation as a sort of using technology, new technologies and innovation, but also I was thinking how you're applying new approaches, or kind of thinking out of the box, or reaching out those who been otherwise marginalized and vulnerable. Like, for example, back in Kyrgyzstan, we work with religious leaders, in particular Islamic clergymen. And this is something, I mean, and if we are talking about peace building, if we're talking about like a long-lasting peace, then it's, and I'm glad, and this is something what Jonathan also said, that it's the shift toward the sort of mainstreaming the peace building across the development work. And then also, I would say we need to focus more on the prevention. If we talk about it, the technology, I mean, if we will focus on that, the technology is a tool to do that, reaching out those who otherwise would not reached out, and then also applying new approach. Again, talking about our experience in Kyrgyzstan, reaching out those like Islamic clergymen, of course, I mean, it's you have to think about in what language do you speak to them? You need to speak their language. And we were able to apply, and also sort of new innovation, not only the technology, but the way how we speak to them, and training them on civic education, but through the script. And also training them on the it's actually prevention of the domestic violence. It's about the role of women in Islam. So we haven't really talked about it these 2 days, but I think it's another sort of angle we need to look on innovation. Sort of, it's a new approach. If we talk about if we should speak about technology, then and I liked something that we, you know, throughout all 2 days, there've been a discussion about how to use available and open sources for the work that we do, and then also not forget about like our traditional sort of approach, traditional tools, but integrating technology into what we've been doing so far, because we should not, you know, like forget about everything else that was done before, and then say like now we need to use you know, innovative way using this technology. So I would rather say like social media, for example, it's something that we should use, but also integrating into what we are doing. For example, back in Kyrgyzstan, this is another way how we are reaching out the youth, and especially in this world for developing this counter-narrative against the challenges that we have now, you know, like because of through, I mean, in open space, there's a lot of information coming out, especially to the youth. And we should not forget that the youth, most of them already now been born and raised during the period when, you know, smartphone was available already, internet is available, so they don't know about the old-fashioned sort of approach, especially for the awareness raising, for education, etc. So we need to kind of think by their words, by their thought, you know, through their sort of minds. And that was, for example, you know, we've introduced these youth discussion clubs to discuss with youth issues about religion, about democracy, and in a secular, how it applies to the circular democratic state. The topic itself, it's very difficult and it's very vast. You know, you can imagine how many issues could be raised during these discussions. And when we initially applied, traditional way of like in a traditional setting, discussing with young generation these issues, it's been very difficult to kind of have their attention and sort of get their thoughts out. But once we were able to do this also through the messengers, through the social media, so and then we were able to develop this flow of the dialogue. And this is the new way of setting up the dialogue and discussion with the new generation. So I think this should be sort of like both ways. We need to not forget about the best practice, but also apply a new technology, integrated the new technology to that work. And what else I was going to say? It's basically, one more thought was about new types of conflict need new analysis. And this is also struck me when we were discussing about what does it mean, new analysis? What does it mean obtaining new kind of research, new data? So it shouldn't, we were talking about top-up, but also bottom-up approach. And that requires, especially if we're talking bottom-up approach, that requires learning, educating, giving a new knowledge, sort of like developing responsible citizenship, also developing a capacity, a local capacity. And this is something that I'm glad Jonathan also mentioned, developing local capacity, and then also research and analytical capacity. This is something that is important in ever sort of globalizing world now. There's no like local, there's no sort of now it's becoming the world become really global. So basically there is no local and not local. Right. So so that's why it's very important to focus on that. We haven't really discussed about it, but I think this is something that should have been discussed probably further.
Thank you very much. I think you've raised a lot of really interesting issues around innovation in peace building, innovation in conflict prevention, and what that looks like, which is not at all necessarily related to the digital transformation. And I think that is a really important issue that we should take into tomorrow. You also commented on, technology is a tool. That phrase, and one of the takeaways for me this last 2 days has been the discussion about, well, actually technology isn't neutral. It is a tool, but also it does things. So I think that's a good lead-in to introduce Hossein, who is a research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center and has written on a lot of issues. He's going to make a few comments on power and decision-making. And, is technology just a neutral tool for us, or does it do other things?
Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me, UNDP, and thanks for staying for this last panel. I know everybody must be very tired. This has been like a startup kind of time cycle with 12 hours of work. So I would like to provoke a little. I would love to say that we are observing a paradigm shift, and I think we're seeing the signs of the end of techno-determinism. And since innovation and disruptive innovation has been part of that discourse, and it has also been part of another discourse, economic discourse of the late capitalism, which has been about privatization. It's been, to some degree, in many areas, it has been a euphemism for privatization, especially when it gets out of where it belongs, which is the sphere of business. So when we talk about and when we think about innovation and disruptive innovation when it comes to governance and other areas, schools, prisons, many other areas that are not universities that are not seeking private interest necessarily, and there are public services, we have to bear in mind that on the back of this discourse that started from Silicon Valley, and it was a for-profit idea there is this underlying concept of privatization and deregulation. I would say it's intrinsic to this idea. So I would say that now, with maybe after a few decades, maybe 20 years almost, of this obsession and fascination by technology and its disruptive, innovative aspects, we're now entering a new era which would be more about regulation and re-regulation, and we are already seeing signs of it. Who would imagine that suddenly, from one of the most anti-regulation parts of the world, which champions free speech, absolute free speech, which is the United States of America, the public debate would suddenly change in maybe less than a year to, regulating platforms. And sometimes it's even becoming so radical that it's unbelievable, because it's becoming about regulating speech with, despite the First Amendment and all those things. And you've seen and heard many stories and reports about how Facebook is being seen as a danger, as a threat, and calls for regulation. Obviously, the European initiative of GDPR also helped that, and I think the American legislators have been very encouraged by that European initiative to break the taboo of regulation. So I think, unfortunately, I think the UN has arrived a bit too late to this idea of innovation. This is almost the end of it, and I think the next decade I think the next decade is going to be about thinking about responsible innovation, at least, because innovation is both a term of a noun, an act, and also a discourse. And I think the discourse, which entails privatization and deregulation and disruption in that kind of meaning, which, in the words of one of its champions, I think his name is Josh Lineker, it's about, forget rules, forget loyalty, forget responsibility, forget common good, and all these things. These are all intrinsic into this idea. So we can't apply that kind of disruptive innovation to many areas of governance, health, education, and those things. So I think maybe we should start talking about responsible innovation versus disruptive innovation, which, to be honest, I think it's another euphemism for research and development departments that many organizations have had, and this has just been a sexy, new, trendy word, innovation. I mean, that came out from Silicon Valley like many other trends, and since business schools are amazing marketers of ideas as well, it has dominated the whole world in a sense that, it's reached the UN, which I wouldn't necessarily see any link with it to this idea. So I would expand that a little in some other questions, but I would also love to encourage everybody to read this amazing piece from a couple of years ago by Jill Lepore, the American historian, about this whole idea and the history of this word and this discourse. The piece is called Disruption Machine, and it's an amazing piece, and I would probably read a little one paragraph of it later.
Great, thank you very much for the provocation and for suggesting that maybe we've just come to the party 15 years too late. I think it's something that we can carry on discussing. I'm sure people will want to respond. I think the important question for us is, this discourse exists, it's out there. Do we, in whichever organization we sit, have a considered response to it? Have we thought through the opportunities, the risks, the challenges, and so forth? And do we know what our position is on these issues as an organization, and for us, for the advice that we give on these issues? Following on from that, also on the topic of power and decision making, I'd like to introduce Sana Farrukh, who is a research associate at the Digital Rights Foundation, who is going to share with us some insights from your work. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think I'll just start by talking a little bit about what we do. So the Digital Rights Foundation is an NGO in Pakistan. We work on data protection and the right to privacy. So, I mean, we have a bunch of different projects going on usually at the same time, but overall we work on advocacy. So we're usually drafting policy briefs or trying to revisit legislation with parliamentarians. Besides that, we conduct research. So what we're about to send out soon is on ride-sharing apps and the data concerns with those. And then we have smaller sub-projects that one of the biggest ones is the cyber harassment helpline, which I will use as an example later. So basically people who are victims of cybercrime will call in, we'll give them digital security tips to, you know, if they've been hacked, what they can do and to recover their accounts. Then we'll give them legal advice if they want to take their case forward or whatever authority is currently investigating it under the legislative framework that is developed at the time for it. So we do all of that, but our work is, because we're very cognizant of the fact that access is a really big issue in Pakistan, specifically in terms of the divide, the gender divide, where a lot of women don't have access to the internet or don't have access to just because they don't have basic access to the internet, are more vulnerable to attacks on their privacy. A lot of our work is focused towards them. So whenever we're working on research, it's from a gender lens. Whenever we're making policy briefs, we're trying to, I mean, for example, the cybercrime legislation that's in place that is, I mean, it's been in place since 2016, but one of the biggest drawbacks is that it doesn't address transgender people. Like it excludes them in many ways. So does the Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act. And all of these different types of legislation tied together. And our advocacy work on these is how we work on policy as a small organization that works in Pakistan. I liked the fact that, I mean, a lot of the panelists have been talking about the bigger issues, but because we're a smaller organization that works on the ground, I can only, I mean, I've had trouble during the last 2 days trying to think of the scalability issue and think on the larger scale when all of my solutions are specific on-ground solutions to real-life problems that we have. So specifically, if we talk about, for example, one of the first sessions that we had where we discussed big data and how to use it and then how to link that to governance and policy. It was nice to be faced with that question of scalability and how I can relate that to a policy perspective or change on that level. But the way that I would look at that is to perhaps, if we're using our cyber harassment helpline data, which is all anonymous, whatever we collected is absolutely anonymous. We assess it in terms of numbers, in terms of age group, who reaches out to us, what action they end up taking, because a lot of people drop their cases. Right now, our research is focused on the victim's perspective of things. Those are the numbers that we're counting. But if we were able to use public Twitter profiles, and the internet is, I mean, financially it is accessible, it's not exceptionally expensive. Most people have a phone and have access to the internet, unless they're in very far-flung areas. If we were able to use publicly available data to catch trends in how cybercrime is perceived by society in general, that would help in our advocacy work at the end of the day. Because right now, when we meet parliamentarians one-on-one, a lot of them say, because we have a Prevention of Cybercrime Act, we don't need data protection legislation. But if we can show the gap between, I mean, in practical terms, in all of the calls we get, a lot of people, although some actions are criminalized, don't believe that the corresponding rights exist in Pakistan, or there are basic inherent rights that are derived from the Constitution of Pakistan. Because they're not able to make that link on a policy level, they're not able to make that link because we don't have the data to prove it. We only have the case studies of victims that allow us to actually publish research on their work. So that's one way that we could use publicly available sources of information to add to our advocacy work. But even though it's been good to be consistently hit with that question of think on a larger level, how can we link the work that you're doing in your particular organizations to these key phrases or these key goals that we're trying to meet. Often I find that it's limiting, because I heard in one of the plenary sessions, somebody was talking about how change or actions that you take on a non-national or not international level. Somebody said, it's fun, it's cute, it's nice, but it's not going to make a difference. And I mean, I think I almost like laughed out loud a little bit, because that's a very strange way to look at the kind of work that's done internationally. I don't think the root of it is not principles or abstract principles of how things are related. The root of it is in every jurisdiction, in every area, the actual decisions and plans and policies you make that are tailored to that area that actually affect change. It's nice to think that ideally we would have these overarching policies that you can customize to all areas all over the world, and then have equality of access, equality of all citizens. But that's not practically possible. Even in an ideal world, that would mean you have homogeneous conditions everywhere, which is not true. So while it's nice to think of the scalability of our solutions, the solution itself is probably going to be highly customized to the problem of that area. So it's good to think about the major principles at play, but in terms of somebody who works on ground, and I was happy to hear from my fellow panelists that, you know, she's talking about very specific solutions for those areas. That's important in every place. So I would like to think that in the future you wouldn't be thinking of it in terms of, if it's such a small solution and you can't really think of scalability for that exact solution everywhere else, that it should be discounted. It shouldn't, because it's tailored for a reason. And that doesn't mean that it's not sustainable, or that it doesn't eventually lend or link back to one of your overarching policy concerns. So I think that's somewhere that I would start.
Thank you very much indeed for that very strong discussion of what scalability, you know, problems with concepts around scalability and who is being affected by the work that we all do in our different contexts, and the fact that it's actually the effect on people's lives that we're looking at. Last but very much not least, I will hand over to Martin, who is Director of Measuring Justice at the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, and he's going to provide us with some reflections on the inclusive justice, human rights and rule of law package of thoughts.
Thanks, Sarah. If I knew I were last, I would buy and distribute perhaps free tickets to Bosphorus tours or something like that, just to make sure everybody remembers the conference with great pleasure, but I'm unprepared for that. A few reflections from the work of HiiL Innovating Justice, and HiiL stands for Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, and reflections on how I see these, the discussions during these 2 days through the prism of our work with legal or justice innovators. First, I want to pick up on one phrase. I think Indy said that the needs are huge, the needs are incredibly high. We do a lot of research to figure out what are the legal problems in daily lives, what sort of problems people encounter and how they need the law for things like divorce, being sacked from work, being fined on the streets, etc., etc. And through extrapolation, we find that every single year there is at least 1 billion serious and difficult to resolve legal problems, which for the people who experience them are very impactful and have a big amount of negative consequences. We see also that a lot of these problems concentrate in specific categories. Like 60–70% of the problems are about land, about labor, employment, disputes with neighbors, crimes, and a couple of other categories. But the thing is, legal problems are clustering. You can sort of predict them. You also see that about 40–50% of the legal problems remain unsolved. So thinking about the scale, this is a lot of problems and a lot of unfairness remaining on people. So the question is, how do we respond to that? One way to do to respond is to do the typical law and development thing, training more lawyers, training more judges, building or renovating courtrooms, police stations, etc., etc. We believe that one way to respond and to deliver more access to justice is through legal innovation or innovation. A few examples of the innovators that we are supporting throughout the years. HiiL is also operating as an accelerator. At this very moment in the Netherlands, there are people who are divorcing online, just sitting in front of computers and divorcing. I understand the excitement, but also people are not only using online platform, they are using platform which is helping them in more supportive way to go through the process. In Ukraine, you can register a trademark or a patent via bot. In Ukraine, everything happens via bots, apparently. But this is 3 times cheaper than going to a lawyer. In Uganda, tens of thousands of people are held by an organization called Barefoot Lawyers. There is a similar organization in India. This is a different entity. But a couple of guys in Kampala are answering SMSs, phone calls, Facebook messages on WhatsApp, etc., and are helping thousands of people, something that the lawyers in Uganda cannot do. So there are plenty of examples of innovation and how innovation, especially in the legal sector, is helping and solving problems. A couple of lines on what we find important for innovations to work. One very important thing is to focus on specific problem. People in the streets do not have problems with governance or with access to justice or with democracy. People have problems with very specific situations. And innovations work best when they're focused on solving a specific problem. Second, it is very important, and I think for UNDP it is very crucial to acknowledge that innovators work best when they are in ecosystems. Isolated innovators can produce great results, but for sustainable innovations, solving a lot of problems, innovators have to work with peers, they have to be supported. So building an innovation ecosystem or ecosystems is very important. Another thing is, especially in the legal field, it's not only technology based innovations. A lot of innovations can happen through very simple process redesign, through focusing on just on the needs of the user. So it's not always technology. It's very important also to acknowledge that innovation relies on accepting failure. Without the willingness to fail, it's very difficult to innovate. And especially in the public sector, this is a barrier that is pretty difficult to overcome. Considering again the scope of the problems, I think it is very important to focus on innovations that can scale and solve thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, eventually billions of problems. And last but not least, I want to point out also it's very important to focus on vulnerable groups that might not be benefiting from the mainstream innovations. And we don't want to create divides and then have another wave of conferences and thinking how to bridge the gaps through these groups. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much also for providing a very specific list of practical points for us to end the panel part of the discussion on. I would like to point out that we did have a government representative who was supposed to be appearing on this panel. She wasn't able to come, so we did try to match from different groups for this final panel, from academics to practitioners to activists and so forth. We're aiming to finish in 15 minutes, so I think rather than have further discussion amongst ourselves, I'm sure there are many points in the audience, people who would like not so much to ask questions, although you can ask questions to the panelists, but would like to make a contribution to the debate, to the issues that have been brought up. Obviously, a whole range of issues there. I heard the issue of the fact that this is a values discussion and that we shouldn't be techno-determinists. maybe we're not, but anyway, that there are value issues. What type of innovation are we talking about here? That it's not necessarily digital, it's not you know, there are innovations in the way we do things and processes, and the need to focus on whose views, whose concerns, whose perspectives are being looked at in terms of the problems that we're solving. There were a whole range of others, I won't summarize them. But the floor is open. Do we have somebody to facilitate with microphones? Because I can't necessarily see. I may need to stand up to facilitate this bit. I see one hand there to start us up. What I suggest is we take a few, and then we hand back to those panelists who would like to pick up one of them. I see one in the middle there to start with.
Thanks. A question to Martin and really whoever else wants to pick it up. I think this is kind of an important intuition. If I understand it correctly, you've been saying you can innovate disruptively in service provision, which is one of the things government does, but you should probably not innovate too disruptively in the governance level. And I liked Martin's point, because what it says is that service provision is about solving problems, but governance is not. In a way, governance is like falling in love. I mean, if you want to avoid problems, don't. It's a gift that you give to your fellow humans, that you get involved in that stuff, and the innovation behavior should be different in the different components. Is that what you're trying to say?
Do you want to clarify whether governance is like falling in love? I wish.
I love a couple of things, running, Asian food, etc. I'm not an expert in love. So I'm not an expert. Yeah. I think in terms of disruption, specifically in the legal fields, and there are plenty of lawyers here, I know. Specifically in the legal fields, innovation is stifled by monopoly. And I'm not going to get deep into this debate, but there it is very important to disrupt this monopoly in order to provide certain services. And my greatest example here is LegalZoom, which was sued by virtually all state bars in the States for different sort of breaches of ethical rules. But they persevered, found different ways to get out from these legal battles, and continue to serve and to deliver legal services to people who need them. So I think, especially in the legal field, in the field of justice, it's very important to disrupt and to go through the traditional lines of service provision. I'll think about the love question, and simply not prepared.
Thank you. Hossein, did you want...
Before the time is up, I wanted to add something that I missed as one of the examples that I think the next decade would be thinking about and working on, is this idea of redefining what smart technology means. Because so far, smart technology has been mainly devices that could connect to the internet. Basically, smart fridges, smart everything. So I think the next decade would be about bringing social norms to technology, and then we would be able to call them, socially smart or real smart technologies. So by that, I mean, give you some examples. If you're drunk, your car should not turn on. If you're angry and you're tweeting something really angry, a smart Twitter would make you second guess or make you delay it, or would understand it and would question you. If you're having a conversation with somebody, again on Twitter, for example, somebody who's just registered should not be able to get into that discussion until you're done with it. This is a different approach that I would call bringing social norms to technologies, because this universal equality, sort of the slogan of universal equality or equal access to everybody in technologies have been really damaging, and now we're only seeing the results of it. because of, you know, the dominance of the previous discourse of techno-utopianism, techno-determinism. And now I think with the discussions about the ethics of AI and, you know, regulating speech and platforms and all those kinds of things, it's time to think, to have a new approach towards technology.
An interesting idea. I would say, if you're drunk, should your Twitter app not open as well? But you know, I also think that maybe there are interesting questions there around who decides what the social norms are and whose social norms are embedded in the systems, which starts opening up the questions of, you know, algorithms and how we can make those more transparent. But do I see any more hands of people who wish to enter this conversation? Or is everybody... one, Minerva, right at the back. Is there a mic down at the back? Okay, there's the lady in... Yeah. Minerva, can you wave? She's at the back.
Thank you. Very fantastic and very thought-provoking discussions. Just to elevate this, because we're going for the next-gen Gov. A lot of the things that we have discussed in the past 2 days were about application of new tools or new applications of old tools in governance challenges, right? Or enhancing governance, inclusive governance. But we're also now talking about new challenges to our governance of technology itself and our use of technology. You will recall, we will all recall, there was a meeting convened in Geneva at one point about the use of robots for war, for conflict. So it's those kinds of issues that we're looking into now. We have been doing this use of new tools in governance. We've been doing that in UNDP for decades, in fact. Maybe we're not just good in conveying or sharing those, but in thinking about the next-gen governance, we're thinking about all this new terrain where our use of technology, our governance of that use, and technology itself is now posing a lot of challenges also for how we do development. So any thought on that?
Thank you. We'll take a couple. We'll do just, are there any other comments? And then I think I'll return to the panelists for a final word and we'll wrap up. Are there any others down at the back? No? Are there any further down in the front? Is everybody just exhausted and had too much information and too many questions? Okay, why don't we just return? Did anyone want to pick up Minerva's question, Leif?
I think what emerged as a central line here is how to reconcile new technologies and maintain a human-centered orientation. We might get rid of innovation or a neoliberal reading of innovation, but we will not get rid of new technologies. And if they really are able to bring new levels of social control, we can be reminded that in building free societies 100 years ago, social control was one of the elements that was significantly reduced. So actually these new tools really have intrinsic values in here. It is questioned both for democratic governments, protecting basic rights of citizens, but it is a question also for authoritarian governments who could easily use these solutions for more social control. So this is a really way of thinking forward.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think it's also the way governments often frame the use of this technology when announcing it to the public. Like, so the city that I live in, Lahore, is a smart city, but when they announce it, they call it the Safe City Project. And then in trying to get people on board, as soon as they announced it, they credited another international cricket tournament taking place in our city to the fact that the Safe City Project now exists. And every time there are internet and signal closures in other cities, and there aren't in Lahore, they'll credit it to the Safe City project, even though we know statistically there's no correlation between crime going down when there's more surveillance. So it's the way that the government frames the use of new technology in monitoring and in surveillance. And interestingly, it's also the way that we as organizations frame our discussions on these issues. Like whenever we have digital security training, we don't call it digital security training, we call it something else. Whenever we have national conferences or conferences in far-flung areas, suddenly we're not using the word surveillance anymore, we're talking about it in other terms. So it's really about, like you, Shakirat, said in the beginning as well, how you need to know who you're talking to, you speak their language, otherwise it's very easy, especially in countries where people already don't have a lot of knowledge on subjects, to be controlled by the narrative that whoever is powerful in that area tries to spin for them.
Thank you very much. A really important point, and I think we need to have much more discussion, not now, but around this, you know, who's controlling the narrative in what way, and what does that tell us about the power dynamics in society. Again, I thought the keynote this morning was really excellent about the issues it raised on how these technologies could be used to strengthen existing power, you know, entrench existing power relations. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be thinking through, well, you know, how do we mitigate against that? I'll just check with the panelists before we close. Does anybody want to make any other final remarks? Okay, we're going to close the panel then. I'm not going to attempt to wrap up the whole conversation we've had, let alone the whole conversation we've had over the last 2 days. I was struck, as I think it was Pia actually earlier this afternoon, who talked about the importance of imagining our future. I think she used that phrase, the line wasn't very good, but it was about the importance of imagining what we want, that it's a values-based approach. What do we want, and then what do we need to get there? And I think if you read some of the literature around these sorts of areas, there are different futures predicted. Some people talk about a sort of utopia with greater equality, perhaps also a universal basic income to even out some of the issues. Some people talk about a dystopia with, you know, decentralized systems and cryptocurrencies and so forth. Some people warn against a techno-authoritarianism, that the control of these technologies by malevolent forces or malign ones, and there's all sorts of variations in between. So I think what is important, as I started off by saying, that we've talked about these 3 areas. We've talked about the innovation and the scalability, and some interesting differences here on the panel on the issue of scalability as well. We've talked a little bit about the policy environment, the incentives, and how do you make change in that. But we also do need, wherever we sit really, to have that conversation about, well, bigger picture of, is there such disruption that how we are governing our societies is changing, and what does that mean for where we sit within our different organizations and communities. So at this point, I think I will finish this panel, thank my panelists very much, and hand over to Isabel. Good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Panel is done, right? So, long 2 days. How does everybody feel? Who's really tired? Boo. Okay. All right. Well, we are at the end of 2 days, and we have agreed to do a very snappy 3 times 90-second reflection from Indy, Isabel, and myself, and then Gerd to in a little bit more than 90 seconds. 95. Close us out. Indy.
Cool. Look, thank you to everyone, firstly, for being attentive and being here. But also, I wanted to recognize a little bit of the journey we were on. In May this year, Shelley created some space for a next-gen governance conversation to happen. That space has fronted into 300-odd people being in the room talking about the future of governance. Here's the obligation. Even when we did the first conversation with 40 people turned up and the space that was created, experiments popped up. Experiments which had meaningful outcomes. This is an investment by UNDP into all of us and this conversation. The obligation here is to turn that investment into genuine experiments with meaningful impacts for the seriousness of the next 10 years, right? This is an investment into all of us to think about this future, and let's enjoy that, and let's respect that opportunity with that. With that, I end.
Wow, I lost my bet. I thought Indy would talk way more than 90 seconds.
I would also like to thank everybody. I think it was certainly for me an amazing experience where we came from since April. I think these 2 days showed us that there is still much work out there to address the challenges of governance and peace building, but that there are huge opportunities which come with new technologies and innovation, but there are also huge risks which we need to manage. But I think I'm very optimistic that in having these discussions together, that we find this helps us to find responses to these challenges of governance and peace building. Now, I hope that it's not too late. Hossein said the UN came a bit too late to innovation. I hope it's not too late, and I hope we as the UN can contribute to this innovation, which is also based on the norms and values of the UN, and contribute to this responsible innovation, as it was called. Thank you.
And from my end, I would just like to take us back to the graph with which we started. I hope that during the 2 days, we got to put a little bit of a shape and form on that gap. And I hope that the people who we brought in the room showed us what are the strides that they're making to close that gap. And if there is one takeaway from me that I heard continually from people who I've spoken to, is one of the most fundamental shifts that we need to make, and it is a mindset and cultural shift as well as policymaking shift, is long gone are days in which policy gets to be pushed from top down, where we pretended to know what the future holds. What we need to do is build policy out of what happens on the ground. Whether we call them experiments or piloted prototypes is less important than through that work on the ground, we get to learn about changes that are happening. So it isn't about making solutions, but building capability to continually understand what is the reality that we face. Thank you.
Thanks, Millie, Indy, and Isabel. A couple of words, perhaps, in closing, and kind of taking us back to where we started on Tuesday morning. The Istanbul Innovation Days have had quite a journey by now. This was the 4th iteration, the 4th time that we did Istanbul Innovation Days. It's been growing in scope, in size, in geographical representation. It's become almost a global event. From a UNDP perspective alone, all the regions and many country offices are here. Sorry, I hear you couldn't hear me. Should I start my 90 seconds again? This is how you enlarge 90 seconds. No, look, we really have grown IID quite a lot. It's really become a community of very diverse groups. It's been an interesting journey also for this time, because it's the first time that we really focus on the subject matter, which we didn't really do in the past. Next Gen Gov is born in a way this year. It's not even a toddler. It's kind of on its way. But we need to nurture and feed it to grow to where we want it to be. And in a way, that analogy of a toddler growing up has a lot to do with, for me, with what innovation ultimately stands for. No, we looked around, or we looked at a reflection of evidence-based versus experimental type of work. We looked at various concrete experimentations, some confusing, some inspiring, some almost threatening a little bit, but certainly all of them very provoking. We looked at this full horizon overall. We can call it innovation, we can call it different things, but at the end of the day, it is all about learning. It's about a continuous process of learning. It's about going deeper, going further, and going wider in how we work. Fully recognizing that the days where we work from a relatively simplistic template of some form of a project document will soon be gone. We have to think in a different way going forward to tackle the type of issues that we are engaging in. And I think these 2 days have helped us quite a lot to get onto this process. So the learning process needs to continue. We'll find ways of continuing. I guess in a way, the way I would put it for now is that for us, we're open to business. We really want to make sure that the type of community and the type of partnerships that have evolved in coffee breaks and in the meetings and in discussions and in showing experiments take the next steps where they can, evolve to where they can evolve to. But certainly from a UNDP perspective, we would like to start thinking in that much wider sense and be open to a different way of working going forward that really does allow us to go deeper, further, and wider than we may have been, than we may not have been able to do all times so far. The nice part of a closing word is to be able to thank a lot of colleagues. And I hope you bear with me. I know you're tired. I see some of you having one eye open and the other one kind of half closing. Bear with me for a moment, because these 2 days took quite some time, if you wish, to evolve to what you have witnessed over the last 2 days. Not even to talk about the day of reflection, if you wish, that would follow tomorrow, which brings together all the UNDP colleagues to really then see more concretely what that means for us, where the risks and opportunities and challenges for UNDP in this may sit. But the evolution of this process has had so many hands on deck and so many brains involved that I'd like to take a moment to really ask colleagues to stand up when I raise their names, just to illustrate to you that this was really a large collaborative effort involving many, many of us. So let me start with Asli, Mao, Leila, and Nilgün, and Zana, and Yagis, who have put extra miles and long hours into this event. Please stand up. And if your feet still hold you, please remain standing if you can. I'd like to call on Susanna, Mehmet, Jesse, Doro, Bob, Ulrika, Irakli, Anura, Alexandra, all from the governance team. And our partner along all the way, from Dark Matters, Yera, Carlotta, Chloe, Jost, Oniji, Jack, Aaron, and of course, the three musketeers with Isabel, Millie. I keep forgetting her name, you know. And Indy. Now, a lot of colleagues from the UNDP universe around the globe, from all the other 4 regional hubs and from many country offices, have contributed to where we are in different ways, through blogs and contributions in multiple ways. Can you also all please stand up? All of the UNDP colleagues. Now, please remain standing for a second, because one of the beauties of an event like this is that this is not about a couple of participants coming to sit in and join an event and just listen in. This has developed into a community. This has been a give and take, a bilateral, in all sorts of ways and forms and groups. So all of you who have joined IID, please join us in standing up. So this is a really big thank you to all of you. Those of, mic drop, I should. Those of you who travel soon, wish you safe travels. I hope you stay in touch. I hope you find ways of continuing the dialogues that you have started, continuing the partnerships that have started. Those of you who stay with us for tomorrow, we have one more day to go. Let's make sure that as UNDP, we really put things into action and not just talk, but see where concretely our opportunities sit. And with the final word, a big thanks to Sabanci Museum, an extraordinary venue which we have never tried before. So everybody from Sabanci Museum. And of course our Turkish partners, the Turkish government that has been hosting us here and represented by the Deputy Foreign Minister. And Ultra, the event management company. So a big thanks to all of you. Safe travels, have fun, enjoy. Bye.